The Automat Kalashnikov 47, or AK-47, was originally designed for one purpose: killing Nazis. Now, there have been many weapons which changed warfare, but there have not been so many which have become cultural icons, which have empowered farmers to defeat superpowers, which are plastered on the flags of nations, and which have sent the world's greatest militaries into outright tailspin. That sort of resume belongs to one gun alone. The AK-47 is a masterpiece of engineering. At the same time, it is a piece of junk. Through this strange combination, the Kalashnikov has very literally changed the course of history. The US government had a lot to do with the proliferation of the AK-47, and we'll talk about that later in this video. But at time of recording, the US government isn't doing anything at all. It's been shut down. In times of such remarkable government dysfunction, it's important to understand how we got here. When we look at this story on ground news, we can see some damning differences in coverage between left and right-leaning news outlets. Ground news shows me there are currently 69 left-leaning sources covering this story and 23 right-leaning sources. Those on the right seem to blame the Democrats, noting that they refuse to approve new legislation unless Republicans make concessions on health care. Left-leaning sources use more vague language, saying Democrats and Republicans continue to blame one another. Seeing the different coverage of this kind of story tells us a lot about how news outlets can frame current events to manipulate readers. Still, no matter how we feel, or especially considering how we feel, understanding how news is being reported is at the very heart of understanding our world. Ground news is the perfect tool in this kind of pursuit. In the life of this channel, I've only had 2 different sponsors. That's because I only partner with brands who I genuinely endorse, so when I talk about ground news, it's for good reason. Unlike other platforms, they don't push or suppress stories to influence your perception of the world. Their platform prioritizes giving readers full transparency on today's issues by pulling in the world's perspective on them. Ground News can detect each so-called unbiased outlet's political lean, any history of failing fact checks, and even who's benefiting from you believing their version of the truth. Sorting through the events of the world and how they are being reported has genuinely never been more important. I sincerely believe ground news can help us turn confusion into clarity and clarity into action. Ground news is fully independent and supported by readers like us, but I partnered with them to get my viewers 40% off the same Vantage plan I've been using. Go to ground.news/horses, click the link in my description, or scan my QR code to get unlimited access for $5 a month. Find clarity, support the channel, and your ability to think critically. The AK-47 has its roots in the German invasion of the Soviet Union. In the era, the Germans were utilizing a style of warfare now famously known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. In Blitzkrieg, the Germans used air bombardment and long-range artillery to break through a small point in the enemy's defense, then rapidly flooded into the zone with tanks and foot soldiers. This was tremendously effective. Enemy forces simply would not have time to respond and would fall under the chaos of the German Blitzkrieg. It was even possible for the Germans to destroy an enemy before a counterattack could be launched. During World War II, the Nazis barreled through Soviet towns and villages, indiscriminately killing soldiers and civilians along the way. In September of 1941, the Germans brought their Blitzkrieg to a Soviet city called Bryansk. The Soviets did not expect to win. No German assault in the Soviet Union had failed yet, but they believed they could hold off the Germans long enough for Moscow to build its defenses. Bryansk was, as predicted, a slaughter. The Germans razed 90% of the area's buildings and killed 80,000 Soviets. It is precisely this onslaught that planted the seed of the AK-47. Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov was a Soviet soldier in the battle at Bryansk. During a German attack, Kalashnikov was standing upright in the turret of his tank with the hatch open. Before he could turn his gun on the Germans, a Panzer shell hit Kalashnikov's tank. A piece of shrapnel shredded through his shoulder. In his own words, the pain was immense. A piece of armor had been dislodged from the tank by the impact of the shell and passed through my shoulder. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I came round, we had disengaged the enemy. Someone was undoing my overalls. I felt as if my shoulder and arms belonged to somebody else. Kalashnikov and several others were loaded into an ambulance and sent en route to the closest hospital. But on the first day of their trip, only Kalashnikov and one other could walk unaided. There was no telling where the Germans were or weren't, so under nightfall, the two men and the ambulance driver moved on foot to find help or shelter in a nearby village. Between the three, they carried only one bolt-action rifle and a small handgun. As they walked to the village, automatic rifle fire burst onto the road near their truck. The three men took cover and crawled into a nearby forest. The gunshots continued, this time closer to their ambulance. Once the shooting had stopped, the three Soviets ran from the forest back to their vehicle. The ambulance truck was on fire. The nurse and the doctor were dead in the road. Most of the wounded inside the ambulance were dead, and there was an inch of blood pooling inside the truck. The survivors were mangled and screaming in pain as they died. Kalashnikov vomited onto the road. The driver began to weep. In the days that followed, Kalashnikov eventually made his way to a Soviet military hospital, where he was treated for his wounds. Since Kalashnikov was a young boy, he had always been one to tinker and engineer. Although he had no formal mechanical education, he was something of a natural and had even taken an engineering apprenticeship during his time in the Soviet army. So after the carnage at Bryansk, lying in the hospital, Kalashnikov realized what he could do, what he must do. Mikhail Kalashnikov would create a gun, the perfect gun, the gun that could drive the Germans out of his homeland. A submachine gun is more or less a machine gun which is compact enough for a soldier to carry on his or her person. The gun which the Soviets feared, which had mowed through Kalashnikov's tank and comrades and ambulance, was the German MP-40. It was an effective weapon. As a submachine gun, it fired pistol-sized 9mm ammunition at a rate of 500 rounds per minute. It was lightweight, easy to handle, and its all-metal construction made it a durable weapon for military use. The Soviets were far behind this technology, owing to their own error a few decades prior. In 1916, a man named Vladimir Fedorov had invented an automatic rifle called the Avtomat. It was, in fact, one of the first automatic rifles ever invented. The Avtomat was certainly not a perfect gun, but it was the weapon of the future. Or rather, it could have been. During the Russian Revolution of 1917, Fedorov was declared to have problematic political beliefs, and he was put in jail. Soviet military intelligence believed that wars would always be fought at long range, rather than the close quarters combat in which an automatic weapon like Fedorov's excelled. The military and the party just fundamentally did not understand the Avtomat, and so they destroyed it and its design. But by the time World War II rolled around, it was no secret that submachine guns were the present and future of combat. The Soviet rejection of the Avtomat was a horrendous self-inflicted wound. The Soviet military was now playing catch-up. To fight the German MP-40, the Soviets developed their own submachine gun, but it was heavy, unreliable, and difficult to manufacture. Even the second version of this gun, released in 1941, was poorly constructed when compared to the Germans' superior manufacturing capabilities. Kalashnikov knew that the Soviets needed a gun which could match or exceed the MP-40. So in the hospital, he read every book available about submachine guns. He talked to the other wounded men in the hospital and asked them to describe their ideal rifle. He did not really ask about technical specifications, but instead more practical questions. What did they need in a rifle? When he was discharged from the hospital, Kalashnikov was offered a 6-month recovery leave. He took a train directly to the Alma-Ata engineering yard in Kazakhstan, where he had served his prior apprenticeship. He was something of a war hero by this time, so his former bosses were happy to offer him a workbench there. Through the winter, Kalashnikov worked on a prototype machine gun, which he titled Black Lacquered Machine Gun No. 1. First prototype was summarily rejected by the party, but for Kalashnikov to be discharged and immediately volunteer 6 months of his time for the motherland, and to have actually produced a working automatic weapon on his own accord, was impressive. So the party granted Kalashnikov a spot in a Soviet technical school. Meanwhile, the war was changing once again. A cartridge, in ballistic terms, is the entire piece of ammunition that goes into a gun, of which a bullet is just one part. The Germans had moved from the smaller cartridges in their MP40 to an intermediate cartridge, which was larger than a pistol round but smaller than a rifle round. This would offer the portability of a submachine gun, along with the long-range capability and killing power of a full machine gun. The Soviets were also developing an intermediate cartridge, but they still needed a gun which could fire it. So the party established a contest among designers to create just such a weapon. Kalashnikov was allowed to enter, but he was far from favorite to win. He already had one failed weapon under his belt with the Black Lacquered Machine Gun No. 1. Furthermore, the other entrants were much more qualified, well-known, and prolific than this 20-something ex-soldier. However, this was precisely his power. He had real experience on the battlefield and had spent hours upon hours talking to his comrades about what they needed from a gun. Furthermore, the horrors of Bryansk had implanted into him a sort of conviction that was much more powerful than the profit motive of his competitors. With his gun, Kalashnikov had two things in mind: simplicity and reliability, the latter of which he believed was a consequence of the former. The gun he produced was not masterfully engineered, it was not high-tech. Instead, it was quite dumbed down. The pieces fit together with loose gaps which allowed debris to fall out of the gun. Its mechanics were simple but intentionally robust, so that its lifespan would expand by years over more complex weapons. Although Kalashnikov was a proud Soviet, he was perfectly willing to borrow design elements from other countries. He further had no interest in aesthetics. He did not care where the ideas came from, nor what they looked like when they were assembled. He wanted to build a gun that would work every single time. Over the coming months, his competitors began to fall away. One of them died unexpectedly. Another dropped out. A third also folded, admitting his prototype was too prone to jams. Another man was infamously hot-tempered, and the Soviet government ejected him after one too many disrespectful outbursts. Before long, the contest was a two-man ordeal between Kalashnikov and a man named Dementiev. Eventually, official contest testing got underway. In one of the tests, each rifle was dipped in water, immersed in a sand pit until it was full of debris, and then fired. First up was Dementiev's. The rifle fired 3 shots and then misfired and then failed completely. When the officials tested Kalashnikov's, sand exploded out of the gun, but so did a bullet. The gun proceeded to fire time and time again without any issue. The official statement was made soon after. The 7.62 assault rifle designed by Senior Sergeant Mikhail Kalashnikov is recommended to be fielded. World War II was winding down. Kalashnikov's gun would not be the one to drive out the Nazis. but the weapon was refined, iterated, and put into production. World War II or not, the future was clear. The AK-47 had arrived. By the 1950s, the AK-47 had evolved into the AKM, or AK modernized. The AKM was even simpler and lighter than its predecessor. Today, most AK weapons in circulation are AKMs rather than AK-47s. For simplicity's sake, we will refer to the weapon from here on out as simply the AK. As the Cold War began to ramp up, the Soviet Union envisioned battles occurring quite similarly to World War II. Tight, close quarters encounters. The Soviets planned to adopt their own blitzkrieg strategy, overwhelming opponents with a barrage of small-arm gunfire in tight spaces. Of course, this was the perfect use case for the AK. The Soviet Union also had a huge army of poorly trained soldiers. Many could not read or write, and those who could may not have been able to communicate anyways. There was a vast diversity of languages spoken in the Soviet Union. Again, the AK proved perfect. It was fast, reliable, and it was so simple to use that it required neither training nor instructional manuals. The AK's smaller cartridge also created less recoil than other guns, so poorly trained marksmen could still control the weapon. But this was the Cold War. There was no fighting, at least not on the scale that the Soviets had anticipated. So as the years ticked on, the AK was never truly battle-tested. This all changed in 1956. The Soviet Union dispatched their army to quell a student protest in Hungary. The demonstrators fought back, but they had only carbines and single-shot rifles. The Soviet army easily crushed the revolt using its AKs in the tight urban environment of Budapest. Around this time, American intelligence got word of the previously secret AK. They were unconcerned, likely put off by its ugly, low-tech design. The US military even covertly got its hands on the Soviet weapon and tested the AK. Once again, they were unimpressed and disinterested. In retrospect, this was a critical error. The world's greatest superpower would soon lose a war to that very weapon. The Soviets and the Americans were both trying to make friends around the globe in the 1950s, often via the gift of military equipment, specifically smaller arms. Mostly through other Eastern Bloc countries, the Soviets were providing AKs to developing nations. If a poor country did not want to be seen accepting gifts from the Soviets, AKs were cheap enough that they could buy them outright. The Soviets also offered guidance and education on how to manufacture the AK to what they called fraternal countries. AKs were again cheap to build and easy to build, so factories could produce massive quantities in short periods of time. This is exactly what happened. By the mid-60s, these simple firearms were being made in Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, China, North Korea, and Yugoslavia. Through Soviet bloc back channels, AKs became the weapon of choice for poorly funded militaries across Asia, Europe, and later even into Africa, and we will talk about that soon. The United States believed that if Southeast Asia went communist, the ideology would spread through all of the region to New Zealand and to Australia, which was a little too close for comfort. This was called the domino theory, and it was one espoused by then President Eisenhower. With the advent of nuclear weapons, a direct war between the Soviets and the United States was off the table. Instead, the two countries would fight a proxy war through other nations. Most immediately, that meant Vietnam. The United States thought if they could win wars in these smaller countries, the population would choose democracy and their neighboring nations would follow suit. 2 years before the U.S. invaded Vietnam, the South Vietnamese army were decimated in a battle against the communist Viet Cong. The South Vietnamese were equipped with American M14s, while the Viet Cong had superior AKs supplied by Eastern Bloc countries. In the Vietnam jungles, airstrikes were ineffective. Instead, small military units fought one another at very close range. Whoever fired the most shots tended to win. In this case, that meant whoever had the AK tended to win. So the Americans already knew that their semi-automatic M14s were not suited to the dense, wet jungles of Vietnam. The M14 was a large, cumbersome rifle that warped and failed under excessive humidity. In a place like Vietnam, its failure was both proven and inevitable. Regardless, this was the rifle issued to GIs at the start of the Vietnam War. America soon developed the AR-15 as a superior weapon to the M14, but the ARs were only distributed in limited numbers to elite units. Hoping to correct for the problems with the original M14, the US also distributed 100,000 of the recently developed, updated version of that gun, the M16. The results were disastrous, and yet once again it was a predictable disaster. The Department of Defense tested the gun in jungle conditions, and the M16 proved to be both unreliable and inaccurate. But by this time it was too late, and the weapons were distributed to American GIs. M16s jammed in combat. Soldiers were found dead with broken rifles. They were regularly killed trying to fix their broken guns. Word got around the GIs about the M16s, and a few things happened. GIs who killed Viet Cong regularly took AKs and left their M16s behind. But the AK had its own unique sound, and in the jungles of Vietnam, soldiers often identified enemies by the sound of their weapons. So as more and more American soldiers were unofficially procuring AKs, there emerged a huge problem with friendly fire. This, combined with the fact that the AK was seen as a communist weapon, led the US to ban GIs from using AKs in Vietnam. But even the US government could see the AK was far superior. Specialist American units were specifically permitted to carry AKs. There also emerged a black market for the superior ARs, and many American troops used their own money to buy these weapons illegally. But more broadly, morale cratered now that soldiers couldn't even trust their own weapons. Back home, the public was already growing weary of the conflict, and the M16 issues only made things worse. In letters home to their families, disgruntled soldiers reported their weapons failing. Newspapers ran stories about the broken rifles. National media caught on. Word spread quickly through the United States, eventually reaching the US government. Under increasing media pressure, Congress investigated and had a series of hearings. In one, a U.S. soldier noted, quote, "Before we left Okinawa, we were all issued this new rifle, the M16. Practically every one of our dead was found with his rifle torn down next to him where he had been trying to fix it." There were a few reasons the M16s were failing. Right before the gun had been finalized, the U.S. made a last-minute change to the powder used in its ammo. This new powder was thought to be the culprit for the jams, but the weapons themselves also had to be changed last minute to accommodate this new ammo, so these mechanical changes could have been to blame as well. The humid jungle conditions may have also corroded the barrels of the M16, damaging the mechanics of the gun. The Army did not issue gun cleaning kits to American troops. No one ever found out why, but it was likely a cost-saving measure. Ultimately, GIs often took this to mean that the gun didn't need cleaning. If any gun isn't regularly cleaned, it is much more likely to malfunction. Whatever the precise reason was, the point was being made on the battlefield. Communist China was supplying Kalashnikovs to the Vietnamese, and the Americans were horrified at the success of the weapon. The Viet Cong used speed and camouflage to their advantage, firing short rounds of AK bursts at American soldiers. The AK bullet ripped through the body, and the heat, mud, and dirt of the Vietnamese jungle rapidly caused infections among survivors. In 1968, North Vietnam began a campaign called the Tet Offensive. This was a massive ground attack on American forces, which ultimately proved a defeat for the Vietnamese. But in another way, it was much more than a simple loss. Images played on televisions across America of pure carnage. Vietnamese soldiers armed with the distinct AK rifle assaulting U.S. infantrymen. These graphic scenes magnified anti-war sentiment in America. Newsreels played of the Viet Cong attempting to siege the U.S. headquarters armed with Kalashnikovs. These images elevated the AK from a weapon to a cultural icon. Suddenly, it was the anti-imperial gun, the tool of the revolution. The world was watching through it all, and a few years later, the Vietnamese eventually drove out the Americans. Suddenly, the low-tech, workhorse AK rifle was the gun that beat the superpower. In the wake of the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, communism was growing across the globe. The Soviet Union, in particular, sought to spread its doctrine to parts of the Middle East. Among these movements, the Soviet Union had its eyes on invading Afghanistan. There were various other geopolitical motivations for this Soviet invasion, oil involvement with Iran, for example, but the Soviet Union predicted the war in Afghanistan would be a straightforward, simple affair. It was not. In fact, leader Mikhail Gorbachev later dubbed this war as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on Christmas Eve of 1979, and it was initially a tremendous success. Just 66 Soviet soldiers died, most of them from non-combat injuries. With this early promise, the Soviets were galvanized in their belief that the war would be an easy victory. Rural Afghan opposition groups known as the Mujahideen sought help from the United States. The neighboring nations of Pakistan and Iran supported the Mujahideen, so the U.S. funneled weapons through these countries into the hands of the Afghan fighters. The Soviet army took a scorched earth approach. They overwhelmed Afghanistan with airstrikes and tanks before unleashing ground soldiers equipped with the latest and greatest version of the Kalashnikov rifle. The Mujahideen feared the new AK, which had a cartridge that was both smaller and more destructive than previous iterations. The new bullet fragmented as it entered the body, causing massive damage to tissue and organs. Because it was smaller, it weighed less, so Soviets could carry more rounds at one time. New mechanics in the gun meant it recoiled even less than before, which made the AK easier to keep on target. The Mujahideen shifted to a guerrilla style of warfare. They took cover in caves and canyons. They fought in small battles under the stealth of the natural topography. They found support among rural villages and farmers. This was successful in bits and pieces, but still, they were losing the war. The Mujahideen were outgunned by the Soviets' superior AK rifles. But then, the U.S. exponentially increased their financial support in Afghanistan. In 1981, America sent about $30 million to the Mujahideen. By 1984, that number climbed to over $200 million. A few years later, by 1988, it was $2 billion. The U.S. sent food and supplies, and Americans eventually began to order thousands of AKs from China for the Mujahideen. The weapons were mechanically and tactically superior to the guns the Afghan fighters had been using. They were also much cheaper and more reliably available. Lastly, the Mujahideen using Soviet-designed rifles gave the American CIA plausible deniability. The U.S. did not foresee, though, that they had just, more than any nation or action prior, spread the Kalashnikov rifle to the entire world. A lot of these weapons did reach the Mujahideen, but a lot didn't through corruption, theft, or general disorganization. Many of the fighters themselves even sold their AKs. The result of this was a de facto arms market in Islamabad, Pakistan. There, AKs found their way to gangsters, revolutionaries, extremists, heroin dealers, and even simple citizens who just wanted protection. As AKs flooded the market, the prices dropped and they became even more available for anyone looking for a good, reliable weapon. For those particularly impoverished people, there were also dealers which offered AKs on installment plans. In 1988, a Los Angeles Times story documented the rise of the Kalashnikov in Pakistan, likening the situation to a sort of Pakistani Wild West. For all of these troubles, though, the Americans' increased support for the Mujahideen was effective. The losing war morphed into a stalemate. The Soviets controlled huge amounts of land and cities, but keeping this grip was proving impossible. The vast majority of Soviet resources went to guarding and maintaining the areas they controlled, leaving almost nothing for the Soviets to use in combat against the Mujahideen. Meanwhile, the Americans were keeping the guerrilla fighters well supplied, and the fighting continued to decimate the country of Afghanistan. Even if the Soviets could win, they would be burdened with rebuilding the entire nation. In a deal brokered by the United Nations, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989 in what amounted to an embarrassing defeat. But of course, the AKs in the country and the broader Middle East didn't go anywhere. Shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union fell, and formerly Soviet-friendly nations began to sell their huge stockpiles of Kalashnikovs. Former Soviet soldiers looted armories in their country and sold AKs en masse to criminals and in black market avenues. One Al-Qaeda document from the era says that, quote, "There must be large quantities of the AK and its ammunition because it is the substance of war." But the AK was no longer a Middle East exclusive. It had gone global, not just as an instrument of war, but as the tool for revolution. In the late 80s, superpower support in Africa began to disappear. Countries fragmented into groups which fought each other. AKs had emerged as the cheapest option for these small warring groups. The availability and ease of the Kalashnikov did well to keep the fighting going in Africa, even if it wasn't the root cause. Furthermore, larger nations basically didn't care about tracking small arms. Even if they had the sheer quantity of AKs flooding into Africa, and undeveloped nations would have made any attempts to track them just impossible. These circumstances manifested all across the continent, but we can see it perhaps most clearly in the nation of Liberia. Charles Taylor was an interesting man. He was born in Liberia, then educated in the United States before returning to Liberia to support a coup of the nation. When he was accused of embezzling money from the revolutionaries, Taylor fled to the United States, where he was quickly found and imprisoned. In the American prison, Taylor and a small group of inmates sawed open their cell window and escaped. All of the other escapees were captured, but Taylor went free and fled to Africa. This may sound suspicious, and indeed, Taylor later claimed that his escape was facilitated by CIA agents. While the CIA admitted that they had been working with Taylor in years prior, Taylor's specific allegations about his escape were never confirmed. After arriving in Africa, Taylor was trained in militia action under Muammar Gaddafi, and then returned to Liberia, where he founded the National Patriotic Front of Liberia. This was a small group, but Taylor was able to grow his numbers through two methods. First, he fomented dissent and tribal hatred within Liberia. Second, the NPFL was provided a steady supply of AKs from his mentor, Muammar Gaddafi. Taylor simply offered a free AK to anyone who enlisted with him. He guaranteed that his men could loot, kill, and arrest whoever they wanted. Unfortunately, Taylor had another ostensible moment of genius when he formed his Small Boys unit. AKs were lightweight. They were simple to assemble and disassemble. They could be fired pretty effectively even by shooters with no experience. Moreover, the automatic weapons didn't call for much in the way of accuracy. Cheap ammo and a high rate of fire meant a shooter could just pull the trigger and spray hundreds of rounds at an enemy. So Taylor began to recruit children. Between the perfectly suited AKs and the fearless boldness that tends to accompany youth, Taylor's Small Boys unit became a very effective fighting force in Liberia. Over the next 7 months, Taylor's forces rampaged through the country, now 5,000 strong. They easily took the nation's capital and executed the president. In the years that followed, Taylor accumulated around $400 million in wealth through robbery, extortion, and terror. This wasn't the end of Taylor's story, not by a long shot, but the point had been made. His free AK policy had toppled the country and made him into the richest warlord in Africa. Meanwhile, stockpiles of Kalashnikovs continued to funnel into the continent. Their serial numbers were often scratched away intentionally or from excessive use, but the guns just kept working. Taylor's AK ideology bled through the continent. Tribal communities shifted from spears to automatic weapons, igniting a veritable firestorm of death, destruction, and chaos in pastoral Africa. Tribes could now genuinely fight against governments. Leaders gunned their way into power only to be gunned out by those same Kalashnikovs. The weapon became an integral part of the now famous Rwandan genocide. Rebels traded AKs for food and supplies. Farmers traded cattle for rifles. In some parts of the continent, owning an AK was a rite of passage into manhood. Nations plastered the weapon onto their flags. Even to this day, the Kalashnikov has the moniker of the African credit card. This was not isolated to Africa, though. In these same years, AK fever was sweeping through another part of the globe. Nicaragua was the AK's gate to South America. A man named Somoza Garcia took control of Nicaragua in the early 1930s. Somoza's family held power for decades, mostly through terror, military force, and intimidation. During this reign, they also received financial and military support from the United States on the terms that they agreed to remain anti-communist. Opposition against the Somozas was building in the early 1970s, most overwhelmingly by a group called the Sandinistas. Cuba provided the Sandinistas with resources and support, specifically in the form of Chinese-built AK rifles. As these weapons were funneled through Cuba into the hands of the Sandinistas, the AK emerged as the weapon of the Nicaraguan revolutionaries. The Somoza regime was becoming more brutal, dictatorial, and greedy. The Somoza family ran the country largely just for personal gain. U.S. President Jimmy Carter offered to provide military assistance to the Somozas on the condition that the regime made human rights improvements. The Somozas did exactly the opposite. So in 1978, the United States stopped providing military assistance. Nicaragua fell into chaos, both economic and social. There was massive inflation, violence, food shortages, and unemployment throughout the country. Of course, in these conditions, it was not hard to find disdain for the ruling Somoza family. By 1979, the Sandinistas united several anti-Somoza groups armed with the ubiquitous AK rifle and successfully overthrew the government. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he saw the Sandinistas as pro-Soviet communists who had toppled a country and were spreading their ideology to neighboring Central American nations. So Reagan began to support the remnants of the deposed Somoza regime with funds and military aid. These opposition forces became known as Contrarrevolucionarios, or Contras. Buoyed by support from the Americans, the Contras began to gain a foothold in Nicaragua. As the Contras became stronger, the Sandinistas had to dedicate more resources to fighting them, thus leaving little time or money to spend on reform. As the conflict grew, the Soviet Union provided more AKs to the Sandinistas through Cuban or Eastern European nations. The U.S. became even more involved, building Contra bases and camps throughout Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Honduras. The United States soon became dissatisfied with the seemingly endless conflict, and Congress passed a bill which made it illegal for the CIA to fund the Contras. The Reagan administration all but ignored this new bill, instead continuing funding through third parties and other countries. In 1985, the Contras received 10,000 AKs from Poland. The Polish government denied that they sold the weapons. Critics noted that the shipment was worth $6 million, a nice payday for the severely cash-strapped nation of Poland. The United States came to Poland's defense, declaring that the Contras had stolen the shipment, which was actually intended for a different country. This was the line that the Reagan administration stuck to, claiming they were not providing aid to the Contras. In 1986, the Sandinistas shot down an American-made C-123 cargo plane as it prepared to drop a payload to Contras in Nicaragua. When the Sandinistas investigated the wreckage, they found 70 AKs, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, military supplies, and, most damningly, 2 dead Americans. The evidence was clear. It was an American plane delivering military support to the Contras. Any room for argument was shut down pretty quickly. It emerged that Reagan himself had published a photograph of that exact same plane months prior after a government sting operation in Nicaragua. There was now obvious deceit by the Reagan administration. There was also the issue of the AKs themselves. The communist-hating U.S. president was buying Soviet-style AKs, creating an image of hypocrisy to the whole administration. Shortly thereafter, the Lebanese magazine Ash Shara reported that the United States had been selling weapons to Iran and using the profits to directly fund the Contras. Further investigation revealed even more damning information. An American Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North had set up dummy corporations with bank accounts which he used to funnel American money to the Contras. Additionally, the CIA was maintaining warehouses in North Carolina full of AKs which had been intentionally scrubbed of their serial numbers to make them untraceable. The full report of the Iran-Contra probe was published in 1994, but even that was incomplete. Lieutenant North, who was revealed to be the principal figure behind the arms deals, invoked the Fifth Amendment during questioning. The CIA also refused to reveal the extent of the Contra deals. Even so, the report concluded, quote, "The underlying facts of Iran/Contra are that, regardless of criminality, President Reagan, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of Central Intelligence and their necessary assistants committed themselves, however reluctantly, to 2 programs contrary to congressional policy and contrary to national policy. They skirted the law, some of them broke the law, and almost all of them tried to cover up the president's willful activities." Following this whole ordeal, AKs continued to flow for decades into Central America. They reached militant revolutionaries, drug cartels, and petty criminals in Colombia, Panama, Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil. The United States had opened the dam, and there would be no turning back. Imagine you are the leader of a paramilitary revolutionary force, and you observe the work of other such groups. What would you see time and time again? The AK-47. The Viet Cong drove out the Americans. African revolutionaries toppled their governments, South Americans as well. It is more than a gun, it is a symbol of revolution. But while a revolutionary must certainly be romantic in this way, they even more must be practical. And there is perhaps no more practical gun than the AK. It is incredibly simple to build. Its anatomy consists of very few moving parts. This means it is also cheap to build. Once the infrastructure is in place to create AKs, a factory can churn out thousands at very low cost. The manufacturing specs for the AK-47 and its variants are not as robust or tightly controlled as other firearms, so manufacturers can produce them en masse with very little worry. Thanks to this simplicity, a child, quite literally as has been demonstrated, can learn to use, tear down, and reassemble an AK in a matter of minutes. A person needs almost no training at all to be effective with the weapon. The AK has a modest recoil. It is easy to aim, even for the worst marksman. The parts of the weapon have relatively large spaces between them, allowing dirt and debris to fall out rather than clog the gun. The mechanical action of the gun itself expels debris as it is fired. Even if the user neglects the simple task of cleaning the AK, it is tremendously neglect tolerant. The gun is not invincible, no machine is. However, the AK is so cheap that if and when one fails, it can be replaced very easily. There have too been economic incentives for the AK's proliferation. The Soviet Union did not just give the world the AK, they taught the world how to build the weapon. So over the course of a few decades, millions of these guns have been produced. Replacement parts and replacement guns were always available. The AK is cheap and reliable to build, so it is cheap and reliable to sell. And of course, it is cheap and reliable to fire. The AK-47 and its various permutations are not great guns by most standards, especially not today's. The AK is not pinpoint accurate. It is not the most comfortable weapon to use. It does not feature the latest and greatest in weapons technology. But being a great gun is separate from the power of the AK. It is instead good enough. It is a good enough weapon, and that is what makes it so exceptional. Mikhail Kalashnikov was born in 1919 in a rural Siberian village. His mother bore 19 children, only 8 of which survived. The family went through famine, civil war, and numerous hardships. As a young boy, Mikhail was sent to a labor camp and escaped. He watched Nazis raze his homeland to the ground. Even as an adult, he made no money from his invention of the AK-47. He held no copyright, and the Soviet Union provided no financial reward, only medals and awards of honor. In his old age, Kalashnikov's only income was a Soviet pension, which was the equivalent of $300 per month. This is all to say, Mikhail Kalashnikov was a hard man. Through much of his life, he offered little regret for inventing the AK-47. He always proclaimed to have created the gun for the pride of his country. But as often is the case with age and time, the horizons of Kalashnikov's feelings seem to change. Just before his death in 2012, Kalashnikov wrote a letter to the Russian Orthodox Church. Quote, "Yes, the body brings pain, but bodily pain is nothing compared to those spiritual wounds that strike us in life. I cannot bear my spiritual agony and the question that repeats itself over and over. If my automatic deprived people of life, am I, Mikhail Kalashnikov, 93 years of age, son of a peasant woman, a Christian and of Orthodox faith, guilty of the deaths of people, even if of enemies."